Syria, I want to go to Bahrain. A brutal and bloody crackdown is happening on this tiny island kingdom. It's being called an international humanitarian crisis today. Bahrain here, the assaults against anti-government demonstrators. Since February, protesters and unarmed civilians have been beaten, tear-gassed, tortured, and detained. And today, the American-based group Physicians for Human Rights reveals the Bahraini government's newest targets: doctors and nurses. The group says security forces have detained and tortured more than 30 doctors and medics since the uprisings began, and it calls the abuses horrific, systematic, and surreal. Joining me now, Amber Lyon, who recently was in Bahrain, and the first obvious question is, why target doctors and nurses here?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. That's what Physicians for Human Rights went to investigate, and they say they believe that these doctors are being targeted because they are on the front lines treating the wounded civilians and protesters, and they are eyewitnesses, incredible eyewitnesses at that, to what Physicians of Human Rights is calling atrocities committed by the government.
What types of atrocities, what types of abuses are we talking about here?
Well, they say that doctors are being beaten, they're being detained without reason. They also say that patients are being beaten, and they say that they have forensic evidence. This is the first human rights report to come out with forensic evidence that the government has been shooting birdshot into the villages and tear gassing unarmed civilians.
So I'm hearing you say you added patients in there. So it's doctors, nurses, patients. You have a response now from the Bahraini government. What are they saying?
Yeah, the Bahraini government just sent us a response, and they said that they are not attacking doctors and patients. And they say
they're not.
They're not doing it. They haven't denied arresting doctors. As we said earlier, more than 30 doctors have been detained, but they say they're not beating them. And they also say the reason they have an intense military presence at the hospital is because they blame protesters for taking over the hospital during the heat of the unrest. But one thing's for sure, Brooke, there are 30 doctors right now. Their families do not know where they are. They say they were violently arrested by security forces. And one of these doctors was arrested while he was in the middle of performing a surgery. Security forces stormed in and took him away, and his family hasn't heard from him since.
It's hard to wrap your head around these reports.
It is.
Also, though, the report cites grave breaches in international law.
They say that they are violating the principle of medical neutrality and violating numerous international laws, and they're calling on the UN and US to really push for an investigation. They say that even if you are in a war zone, doctors and patients should be safeguarded, and that that's not happening. They even say they documented one case where about a dozen patients were drugged by security forces, PHR says, out of their beds up to the 6th floor of this main hospital in town, and tortured and then forced to confess to things that PHR says they didn't do.
So this is a report. It was just out today, so maybe it's too early, but has the State Department, has the UN responded whatsoever?
Due to the holiday coming up, there hasn't been much response quite yet, but one thing's for sure, it's definitely creating a lot of noise and getting even more people to focus on what's going on in Bahrain right now, because I've been on your show several times talking about this. This is not the first credible international human rights organization to come out and say that the Bahraini government is committing atrocities against its citizens, and now doctors in this case.
So you mentioned, you and I were talking multiple times last week, and one time you sat down and you were telling me about this woman who said her husband and her father were detained in Bahrain, and she was so furious she was on a hunger strike as a result. Here's what she told you last week.
All I want from the American administration, I don't want them to save the people of Bahrain. I don't want an intervention. All I want is for them to stop supporting the Al Khalifa regime, who have proved now more than ever that they are corrupt, that they care only about their thrones, that they are willing to kill and torture.
So what's the update, Amber, on her and her husband and father?
Well, that was Zainab Al-Khawaja, and her father, an internationally known human rights activist, was detained. And on her 10th day of her hunger strike, when she was getting very weak, her father called. Yeah, she had been to the hospital for treatment. She refused an IV, though, and went back home and was lying in bed. And that's when the family was put in touch with her father after numerous human rights organizations complained. They were able to speak with him for about a minute, and he told them he wanted clothes, some mouthwash, and that he was going on trial the next day. So the next day they went in to bring him those supplies and also to see if they could attend his trial. And they say that's when they were told there would be no trial, and they haven't talked to her father since. But she has ended the hunger strike.
She has.
She says now she's going to focus on raising awareness as to what's going on in Bahrain.
Amber Line, thank you
Thanks,
so much.
Brooke, for having me on.